Experts find photo of 5 children from 1881. They zoom in and instantly go pale. The musty smell of old paper and leather filled the cramped archive room as Dr. Evelyn Harper carefully lifted another dusty photograph album from the towering stack beside her. The Victorian History Research Foundation had been gifted an enormous collection of 19th-century family portraits, and a team of historians had spent 3 weeks cataloging the endless faces staring back at them from sepia-toned memories. "Another day, another 100 deceased people," muttered James Morrison, her research assistant, as he rubbed his tired eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the wooden table where dozens of photographs lay scattered like fallen leaves. Dr. Harper shot him a disapproving look. "These aren't just finished people, James. They're stories. Each photograph is a window into lives that were once as real and vibrant as ours." She had dedicated her career to preserving these forgotten moments, believing that every face deserved to be remembered. The afternoon sun filtered through the small window, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Dr. Harper opened the leather-bound album with practiced care, her fingers tracing the delicate edges of each photograph. Most were typical Victorian family portraits, stern-faced parents flanked by children in their Sunday best, everyone trying to remain perfectly still during the long exposure times. Then she saw it. The photograph was mounted on the album's final page, slightly larger than the others. 5 children stood in a formal pose against an ornate backdrop, their ages appearing to range from about 6 to 14 years old. 3 boys and 2 girls, all with the same dark hair and sharp features that suggested they were siblings. The eldest boy stood behind the others, his hand protectively placed on his younger brother's shoulder. At first glance, it seemed like any other family portrait from the era. But something nagged at Dr. Harper as she studied the image more closely. She reached for her magnifying glass, a tool she'd used countless times to examine historical documents and photographs. "What is it?" James asked, noticing her sudden focus. "Look at this," she whispered, positioning the magnifying glass over the photograph. "The youngest girl, look at her dress." James leaned in, squinting at the image. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, wore a dress that seemed different. While her siblings were dressed in typical Victorian children's clothing, high necklines, long sleeves, and formal styling, her dress had a looser fit, a simpler cut, and most strikingly, a pattern that wouldn't become popular until the early 1900s. "Maybe it's just the lighting," James suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Harper shook her head slowly. "No, look at the fabric. See how it drapes? That's not how Victorian children's dresses were made. And the collar, it's far too modern for 1881. She flipped the photograph over, hoping to find some identifying information. Written in faded ink on the back were the words, "The Whitmore Children, Summer 1881, Millbrook Township." Whitmore. Dr. Harper repeated the name softly. She had spent years studying families from that era and region, but the name didn't ring any bells. "James, can you check our database for any Whitmore family records from Millbrook Township?" As James moved to the computer, Dr. Harper continued examining the photograph. The more she looked, the more details seemed wrong. The youngest boy's shoes appeared to have a sole design that wasn't common until the 1890s. The middle child's hair was styled in a way that wouldn't become fashionable for another decade. Even the photographer's backdrop, while ornate, had subtle design elements that seemed ahead of their time. "Dr. Harper," James called from across the room, his voice tight with confusion. "I'm not finding anything. No Whitmore family in Millbrook Township. Not in 1881, not in any year around that time." "That's impossible," she replied, though a chill ran down her spine. "Every family that could afford a formal photograph like this would have left some record. Property deeds, church records, census data, something." She picked up the photograph again, studying the children's faces. They all looked directly at the camera with expressions that seemed oddly mature for their ages. The eldest boy's eyes held a sadness that seemed too deep for someone so young. The youngest girl's smile appeared forced, as if she was trying to hide something painful. "Maybe the name is wrong," James suggested, but his typing had become more frantic. I'm searching for any family with 5 children in that area during that time period. Dr. Harper felt her heartbeat quicken. In 30 years of historical research, she had never encountered a photograph that seemed so displaced. It was as if someone had taken a family from the 1890s or early 1900s and somehow placed them in an 1881 photograph. This doesn't make sense, she whispered, more to herself than to James. It's like they exist in the wrong time. The room fell silent except for the steady clicking of James's keyboard and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Dr. Harper carefully placed the photograph under her desk lamp, examining every detail with the intensity of a detective at a crime scene. The children's positioning was also unusual. In most Victorian family portraits, the children were arranged by age in a rigid, formal manner. But these children seemed to be clustered together protectively, as if they were shielding themselves from something unseen. Dr. Harper, James said quietly, I've searched every database we have access to. No Whitmore family, no record of any family with 5 children matching these ages in Millbrook Township during that time period. It's like they never existed. She looked up from the photograph, her face pale. That's impossible. This photograph is real. These children were real. They stood in front of a camera, probably held still for several minutes while the exposure was taken. You can't fake something like this with 1881 technology. Then where are they? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harper stared at the photograph, her mind racing through possibilities. Could it be mislabeled? Could the date be wrong? But the photographic techniques, the studio backdrop, even the type of paper it was printed on, everything indicated it was genuinely from 1881. I don't know, she admitted, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. But I intend to find out. As the sun began to set outside the archive window, casting long shadows across the room, Dr. Harper made a decision that would change everything. She would not file this photograph away with the others. She would not simply catalog it and move on. Something about these 5 children demanded answers, and she was determined to find them. James, clear your schedule for tomorrow, she said, her voice filled with renewed determination. We're going to solve this mystery. The photograph lay on the desk between them, the 5 children's faces seeming to watch from across the decades, holding secrets that someone had worked very hard to bury. Dr. Harper had no idea that her discovery would lead her into a web of conspiracy, tragedy, and deliberate erasure that would challenge everything she thought she knew about historical preservation. In the growing darkness of the archive room, the children in the photograph seemed to whisper across time, pleading for their story to finally be told. The next morning arrived with a sense of urgency that Dr. Harper hadn't felt in years. She arrived at the archive before dawn, coffee in hand, determined to trace the photograph's journey through time. The mysterious image lay exactly where she'd left it, but in the early morning light, the children's faces seemed even more haunting. James found her 2 hours later, surrounded by shipping manifests, auction catalogs, and estate sale records scattered across 3 tables. Any luck? He asked, settling into his chair with his own steaming mug. More questions than answers, Dr. Harper replied, not looking up from a yellowed document. The photograph came to us as part of the Morrison estate collection, no relation to you, by the way. Eleanor Morrison died last year at 93, and her family donated her entire collection of historical photographs to our foundation. She held up a faded receipt. But here's where it gets interesting. Mrs. Morrison acquired this particular photograph at an estate sale in 1923. The Blackwood estate sale, to be precise. Blackwood? James leaned forward. That's a name I recognize. Weren't they one of the wealthy families in Millbrook Township? Exactly. Dr. Harper's eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery. The Blackwoods were practically royalty in that area. Owned half the town, including the lumber mills and the railroad depot. But here's the strange part. I found a partial inventory from their estate sale, and this photograph isn't listed. She spread out several documents like a detective laying out evidence. Look at this inventory. It lists hundreds of items, furniture, jewelry, artwork, even other photographs. But not this one. It's as if it was unofficial. James studied the papers, his brow furrowed. Maybe it was added later? Or maybe the inventory is incomplete? That's what I thought initially, Dr. Harper said, pulling out another document. But then I found this. She handed him a letter written on expensive stationery, the ink faded but still legible. The letterhead read Blackwood Manor, and was dated September 15, 1923. My dear sister, James read aloud. I have decided to include certain items in the estate sale that Father specifically instructed should never see the light of day. I can no longer bear the weight of these secrets. The photograph of the 5 children must find its way to someone who can give them the justice they deserve. I pray that someday, someone will uncover the truth about what happened to them. Dr. Harper watched James's expression change as he finished reading. It's signed Margaret Blackwood, she added quietly. The last surviving member of the Blackwood family. She deliberately included the photograph in the sale, against her father's wishes, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. But why would her father want it hidden? That's what we need to find out. Dr. Harper pulled out a thick folder. I've been researching the Blackwood family all morning. They were involved in everything in Millbrook Township, business, social events. But there are gaps in their history. Specifically, around 1881 and 1882. She opened the folder to reveal newspaper clippings, some so old they crumbled at the edges. The Millbrook Township Gazette ran society pages every week, documenting the Blackwood family's activities. But look at this. She pointed to a series of dates. From September 1881 to March 1882, there are no mentions of the Blackwoods at all. It's as if they disappeared for 6 months. James examined the clippings, noting the obvious gap in coverage. Maybe they went on an extended trip? I thought so too, until I found this. Dr. Harper produced a different newspaper, this one from a neighboring town. The Riverside Herald, October 12, 1881. There's a small article about a tragic incident involving an unnamed family in Millbrook Township. It mentions that the local authorities were handling the matter with the utmost discretion and that certain records would be sealed to protect the innocent. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. James set down his coffee, his appetite gone. Dr. Harper, what if the Whitmore family and the Blackwood family were connected somehow? What if something happened to the Whitmores that the Blackwoods wanted to keep quiet? That's exactly what I'm thinking, she replied, her voice tight with excitement and dread. But I need more proof. I've contacted the Millbrook Township Historical Society, but they claim most of their records from that period were destroyed in a fire in 1924. 1924? James's eyes widened. 1 year after the Blackwood Estates sale? Convenient timing, isn't it? Dr. Harper stood and walked to the window, staring out at the bustling city beyond. James, I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger than a mislabeled photograph. I think we've found evidence of a deliberate cover-up. She turned back to face him, her expression serious. Margaret Blackwood's letter suggests she knew something terrible had happened to these children. Her father wanted the photograph hidden forever, but she couldn't live with the secret. She smuggled it into the estate sale, hoping someone would eventually investigate. And now that someone is us, James said, understanding the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. Dr. Harper nodded. I've already booked us train tickets to Millbrook Township. We leave tomorrow morning. If there are any traces of the Whitmore family left, we're going to find them. As they prepared to leave the archive that evening, Dr. Harper took one last look at the photograph. The children's faces seemed more urgent now, as if they sensed that their story was finally being pursued. She carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and locked it in her briefcase. Don't worry, she whispered to the image. We're going to find out what happened to you. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Dr. Harper couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover secrets that some people had finished to protect. The train to Millbrook Township cut through rolling hills and farmland, but Dr. Harper barely noticed the scenery. Her briefcase sat open on the small table before her, filled with every document she'd managed to gather about the mysterious photograph. James sat across from her, typing furiously on his laptop as he searched through digital archives. "I found something," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels. "An obituary from the Millbrook Township Gazette dated March 15, 1882. Dr. Harper looked up from the historical map she'd been studying. "For whom?" "That's just it, it doesn't say. The headline reads beloved community members laid to rest, but the names have been blacked out. Someone deliberately censored it." James turned his laptop screen toward her. "But look at this line, survived by 5 children, ages 6 to 14, who have been placed in the loving care of various families throughout the county." Dr. Harper felt her heart skip. 5 children, ages 6 to 14. That matches the photograph perfectly. "There's more," James continued, scrolling down. "The obituary mentions that the deceased were taken too soon under circumstances that have deeply affected our community. But it doesn't specify what those circumstances were." The train pulled into Millbrook Township Station at noon, and Dr. Harper was struck by how small the town had become. What had once been a thriving industrial center was now a sleepy community with empty storefronts and crumbling Victorian houses. The prosperity that the Blackwood family had brought to the area had clearly died with them. Their first stop was the Millbrook Township Historical Society, housed in a converted church that had seen better days. The elderly curator, Mrs. Dorothy Chin, greeted them with a mixture of enthusiasm and nervousness. "We don't get many researchers here," she admitted, leading them through displays of old farming equipment and faded photographs. "Especially not ones asking about the 1880s. Most of our records from that period were lost in the fire." "We know about the fire," Dr. Harper said gently. "But we're hoping you might have something that survived. We're looking for information about a family named Whitmore, 2 parents and 5 children." Mrs. Chen's face went pale. She stopped walking and turned to face them, her hands trembling slightly. I've been the curator here for 40 years, and I've never heard that name mentioned aloud." "But you know it," James observed. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to whisper about the Whitmore family when I was a child. She said they were good people who got caught up in something terrible. But she always stopped talking when other adults came around." She led them to a small office behind the main display area and carefully locked the door. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's something that survived the fire. Something the Blackwood family never knew existed." From beneath a loose floorboard, Mrs. Chen retrieved a small metal box. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, and a leather journal. "My great-grandfather was the town's telegraph operator," she explained. "He kept personal copies of important messages, including this one." She handed Dr. Harper a yellow telegraph message dated October 3, 1882. "Whitmore parents found finished. Stop investigation closed by order of Judge Blackwood. Stop children relocated. Stop records sealed. Stop." Dr. Harper's hands shook as she read it. Judge Blackwood? The same family that owned the photograph? Harrison Blackwood was the town judge for 30 years. Mrs. Chen confirmed. He had the power to seal records and order investigations closed. But there's more. She opened the leather journal to a page marked with a ribbon. This was written by Mrs. Sarah Whitmore's sister, who lived in the next county. She came looking for the family after they stopped responding to her letters. Dr. Harper read aloud. I arrived in Millbrook Township on October 15, 1882, to find that my dear sister Sarah and her husband Thomas had perished in what the locals called a tragic accident. But Martha Henderson, who lived next door, whispered to me that it was no accident. She said the Whitmores had been asking too many questions about the Blackwood family's business dealings, particularly their involvement with the railroad contracts. The railroad contracts? James asked. Mrs. Chen nodded gravely. The Blackwood family made their fortune by securing exclusive contracts to supply timber for the expanding railroad. But there were rumors that they had bribed officials and cheated other suppliers. If someone had proof of that, they would have been ruined, Dr. Harper finished. Their entire empire would have collapsed. The journal entry continued. Martha told me that Sarah had found documents proving the Blackwoods had been falsifying their timber grades and overcharging the railroad by thousands of dollars. She said Sarah was planning to contact the state authorities. The next day, both Sarah and Thomas were found finished in their home, supposedly from a gas leak. Dr. Harper felt sick. They were finished. And their children were scattered to different families to ensure they could never corroborate their parents' story. James added, the pieces falling into place. Mrs. Chen opened another section of the journal. The sister tried to find the children, but every family claimed they had never heard of any Whitmore children. She wrote, "It's as if my nieces and nephews have been erased from existence. No one will speak their names, and no one will admit they ever lived here. But someone kept the photograph," Dr. Harper said, thinking of Margaret Blackwood's letter. Someone in the Blackwood family felt guilty about what happened. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Chen said quietly. She pulled out a final newspaper clipping, this one from 1923. Margaret Blackwood's obituary. She died 3 months after the estate's sale, and according to this, she left a confession letter to be opened only after her death. Dr. Harper and James exchanged glances. "Where is this letter now?" "The Blackwood family lawyer supposedly destroyed it," Mrs. Chen said. "But my grandmother always believed copies were made. She said Margaret Blackwood wasn't the only one who felt guilty about what happened to the Whitmore family." As they left the Historical Society that afternoon, Dr. Harper clutched the photograph tighter. The children's faces seemed less mysterious now and more tragic. They had been witnesses to their parents' finishing, then deliberately erased from history to protect their finishers. "We need to find those children," she said to James as they walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook Township. "They deserve to have their story told." What she didn't know was that one of those children had spent his entire life waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything. Dr. Harper had spent a restless night in the small bed and breakfast, her mind racing with images of the Whitmore children being torn from their home after witnessing their parents finishing. She was reviewing her notes over breakfast when James burst into the dining room, his face flushed with excitement. "Dr. Harper, you need to see this immediately," he said, placing a weathered wooden chest on the table between them. "The bed and breakfast owner, Mrs. Patterson, heard us talking about the Whitmore family yesterday. This chest belonged to her great-grandmother." Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair, followed James into the room. "I probably should have mentioned this yesterday, but I wasn't sure if it was related to what you were looking for. My great-grandmother, Emma Patterson, used to work as a seamstress for wealthy families in town. She kept this chest in her attic for decades, and when she died, she made my grandmother promise to keep it safe." Dr. Harper's hands trembled as she opened the chest. Inside were folded pieces of fabric, sewing supplies, and at the bottom, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric was remarkably well preserved, and when she unwrapped it, she found several letters tied with a faded ribbon. "Emma always said these letters were from the boy who remembered," Mrs. Patterson explained. "She never told us what that meant, but she insisted they were important." The first letter was dated December 15, 1895, written in a careful, educated hand. "Dear Mrs. Patterson, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to thank you for the kindness you showed to my family during our darkest hour. You may not remember me, but I am Thomas Whitmore, the eldest of the 5 children you helped hide in 1882. I am now 27 years old and living under the name Thomas Morrison in Chicago." Dr. Harper's breath caught. "Morrison, that's the same name as the estate where we found the photograph." James leaned closer as she continued reading. "I have spent the past 13 years searching for my siblings, but it seems the Blackwood family's reach extended far beyond Millbrook Township. Every family that took in one of my brothers or sisters was given money and strict instructions to never speak of our true identities. Most believed we were simply orphans from a poor family." The letter went on to describe Thomas's life in Chicago, where he had managed to secure an education and was working as a clerk in a law firm. But the most shocking revelation came in the second paragraph. I have discovered something that I believe you should know. The Blackwood family did not act alone in silencing my parents. There was a secretive organization called the Preservation Society that specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. Judge Blackwood was merely one member of a much larger network that included judges, lawyers, and businessmen across 3 states. Dr. Harper looked up at James, her face pale. A conspiracy that spanned multiple states? This is bigger than we imagined. The second letter, dated March 3, 1896, contained even more disturbing details. Dear Mrs. Patterson, I have made contact with someone who claims to be a former member of the Preservation Society. He approached me after learning of my inquiries about my family. He told me that my parents were not the first family to be eliminated by this organization, nor would they be the last. He spoke of a deal that was made regarding my siblings and me. Thomas's letter continued. According to this man, after our parents' finishing, the society faced a dilemma. 5 children had witnessed too much, but finishing children would draw unwanted attention. Instead, they orchestrated our separation and created new identities for us. The families who took us in were told that we were part of a witness protection program designed to keep us safe from dangerous criminals who had finished our parents. My God, James whispered. They convinced the foster families they were protecting the children, not silencing them. Dr. Harper continued reading. The man told me that each family was given a substantial sum of money and threatened with consequences if they ever revealed our true identities. We were to live out our lives in quiet obscurity, never knowing the truth about what happened to our parents, or how to find each other. The third letter, dated July 18, 1896, contained the most heartbreaking revelation. Dear Mrs. Patterson, I have located my sister Mary, now called Mary Henderson and living in Milwaukee. She has no memory of our family name, or what happened to our parents. When I tried to tell her the truth, she became frightened and begged me to leave. The family that raised her told her that remembering her past would endanger her life. She has been so thoroughly conditioned to forget that she cannot bear to hear our parents' names spoken aloud. Thomas wrote about his desperate attempts to contact his other siblings, but each encounter ended in failure. The youngest brother, whom he found working in a factory in Detroit, had been told that his original family had died of disease and that remembering them would make him sick. The other sister had been adopted by a religious family who convinced her that her past was sinful and must be forgotten. The final letter in the bundle was dated September 1, 1896, and its contents sent chills through Dr. Harper. Dear Mrs. Patterson, I have made a terrible discovery. The Preservation Society is still operating, and they have learned of my attempts to reunite with my siblings. Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men who claimed to be from the company that arranged our safety. They informed me that my continued search for my family violated the terms of the arrangement made for our protection. Thomas described how the men had offered him a choice: stop searching for his siblings and continue living quietly under his assumed name, or face the same fate as his parents. They sweetened the deal by offering him a substantial sum of money and a promise that he would be allowed to live comfortably as long as he remained silent. They told me that my silence would ensure my siblings' safety. Thomas wrote. If I continued to search for them, the society would be forced to relocate all of us permanently. I understood their meaning clearly. The letter concluded with a passage that made Dr. Harper's heart break. I have decided to accept their offer, not out of cowardice, but out of love for my brothers and sisters. I would rather live the rest of my life in silence than risk harm coming to them. I am enclosing a photograph of our family, taken just months before our parents' finishing. Please keep it safe, Mrs. Patterson. Someday, when the society no longer exists, perhaps someone will find it and tell our story. Dr. Harper stared at the letters, understanding now why the photograph had been hidden for so long. Thomas had sacrificed his chance at reuniting with his family to keep them safe from a conspiracy that had already destroyed so many lives. Mrs. Patterson, she said quietly, do you know what happened to Thomas Morrison after 1896? The elderly woman nodded sadly. According to family stories, he became quite wealthy but lived as a recluse. He never married, never had children. When he died in 1954, he left his entire estate to the Morrison family, no relation to his assumed name, just a coincidence. He specified that his collection of photographs and documents should be donated to historical societies, but only after everyone who knew him personally had died. Dr. Harper realized with stunning clarity that Thomas had been playing a decades-long game, ensuring that his family's story would eventually be discovered, but only when it was safe to tell it. The forbidden connection wasn't just about the conspiracy that had destroyed his family. It was about a promise made across time, waiting for the right people to finally ask the right questions. Armed with Thomas's letters and a growing understanding of the Preservation Society's reach, Dr. Harper and James returned to their hotel room to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. What they discovered in the following hours would reveal a web of corruption so vast that it had shaped the economic landscape of 3 states for over 2 decades. James had been working tirelessly on his laptop, cross-referencing names and dates from Thomas's letters with historical records. "Dr. Harper, I think I've found the connection between the Preservation Society and the railroad contracts," he said, his voice tight with excitement and dread. "Show me," she replied, clearing space on the small desk. "Look at this." James pointed to a series of documents he'd pulled from digital archives. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad awarded exclusive timber contracts worth over $2 million. That's equivalent to about $60 million today, to a consortium of companies between 1878 and 1885. The Blackwood Lumber Company was the primary supplier, but they weren't working alone. Dr. Harper studied the contracts, noting the other company names. Morrison Steel, Patterson Construction, Chin Import Company. "James, these are the same surnames as the families who took in the Whitmore children." "Exactly. It wasn't a coincidence." James pulled up another document. "I found records showing that each of these companies received substantial bonuses for their railroad work, but only after 1882, the year the Whitmore parents were finished." The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. Dr. Harper sat back in her chair, the magnitude of the conspiracy washing over her. They weren't just business partners. They were co-conspirators. The families who took in the Whitmore children weren't innocent foster families. They were members of the Preservation Society. James nodded grimly. And they were paid twice. Once for their participation in the conspiracy, and again for keeping the children silent. Dr. Harper pulled out Thomas's letters again, reading them with new understanding. That's why Thomas couldn't reunite with his siblings. Their adoptive families weren't just following orders, they were protecting their own criminal involvement. A knock at their hotel room door interrupted their investigation. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway, holding another small box and looking nervously over her shoulder. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," she said quietly, "but after giving you those letters, I couldn't sleep. There's something else my great-grandmother left behind. Something she made me promise to only share if someone came asking the right questions about the Whitmore family." Inside the box was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and covered in what appeared to be a diagram. At the top, written in Emma Patterson's careful handwriting, were the words, "The truth about the railroad scandal 1881. The diagram showed a complex network of relationships between various companies, officials, and what Emma had labeled as the inner circle. At the center of the web was Harrison Blackwood, but surrounding him were names that James recognized from his research. William Morrison, Dr. Harper read aloud. Judge Franklin Chin, Railroad Commissioner David Patterson. She looked up at Mrs. Patterson. These weren't just local businessmen. This conspiracy reached into the highest levels of state. Mrs. Patterson nodded solemnly. My great-grandmother worked as a seamstress, but she also served tea at the Blackwood family's private meetings. She overheard conversations that she was never supposed to hear. On the back of the diagram, Emma had written a detailed account of what she'd witnessed. October 1881 overheard Mr. Blackwood speaking with Morrison about the Whitmore problem. Mrs. Sarah Whitmore had discovered discrepancies in the timber quality reports and was threatening to contact Federal Railroad inspectors. Mr. Blackwood said they had invested too much to let one family destroy everything. The account continued. The men discussed how Mrs. Whitmore had copies of documents proving that the Blackwood Lumber Company had been supplying inferior timber while charging premium prices. Worse, she had evidence that railroad safety inspectors had been bribed to approve substandard materials. Mr. Blackwood estimated that if the truth came out, it would result in criminal charges for everyone involved and force the railroad to replace thousands of miles of track. Dr. Harper felt sick as she realized the implications. They weren't just cheating the railroad company. They were endangering every passenger who traveled on those tracks. James found the most damning entry near the bottom of Emma's account. November 1881. After the accident that finished the Whitmore parents, I overheard Judge Chin explaining to the group how they would handle the children. He said each family in the Preservation Society would take responsibility for one child, ensuring they could never corroborate each other's stories. The children would be given new identities and told their parents died of natural causes. But it was Emma's final observation that revealed the true scope of their criminality. I learned that this was not the first family the Preservation Society had eliminated. Judge Chin mentioned the Henderson matter in 1879 and the Williams situation in 1883. He spoke of these as routine business, suggesting they had perfected their methods through practice. Dr. Harper stared at the document, understanding that they had uncovered evidence of multiple crimes spanning several years. Mrs. Patterson, did your great-grandmother ever report what she heard? The elderly woman shook her head sadly. She was terrified. These were the most powerful people in the region, and she was just a seamstress with a young family to protect. But she documented everything, hoping that someday it would be safe to reveal the truth. James had been quiet, absorbed in calculations. Dr. Harper, if they finished multiple families over several years, and each family potentially had children who needed to be silenced, the Preservation Society probably placed dozens of children with member families. She finished. It wasn't just about the Whitmore children. It was a systematic operation. They spent the next several hours mapping out the connections Emma had documented. The conspiracy included not only local businessmen but also state leaders, judges, railroad commissioners, and even federal inspectors. The railroad contracts were just the beginning. The Preservation Society had used their network to control everything from land acquisitions to mining rights to shipping contracts. This explains why Thomas never tried to expose them publicly. Dr. Harper realized. He wasn't just protecting his siblings. He was up against an organization that had finished entire families and had members in every level of leadership. As dawn broke over Millbrook Township, Dr. Harper and James sat surrounded by evidence of one of the most comprehensive criminal conspiracies in American history. But they both knew that their investigation was far from over. We need to find out what happened to the other families the Preservation Society eliminated, Dr. Harper said, her voice filled with determination. And we need to learn how Thomas Morrison managed to ensure this story would eventually be told. What they didn't know was that Thomas had spent decades carefully placing pieces of evidence in locations where they would eventually be found by researchers like themselves. The photograph was just the beginning of a trail he had methodically constructed, leading to a final revelation that would expose not just the conspiracy that finished his family, but the entire network that had terrorized innocent people for over 20 years. 3 weeks later, Dr. Harper stood in her office surrounded by boxes of evidence that would forever change American historical understanding of late 19th century corruption. But the most important discovery had come just that morning, delivered by a law firm that had been holding it in trust for nearly 70 years. The package contained a thick manila envelope marked, "To be opened only when the Whitmore family photograph has been found and investigated." Inside was Thomas Morrison's final letter, dated December 1, 1953, just months before his death. "My dear future investigators," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then my carefully laid plans have finally come to fruition. I have spent the last 60 years of my life not in defeat, but in preparation for this moment." James looked up from his own copy of the letter, his face filled with amazement. He knew that someday, someone would find the photograph and follow the trail he created. Dr. Harper continued reading aloud. "I have never stopped searching for my siblings, but not in the way the Preservation Society feared. I became Thomas Morrison, a successful businessman, and I used my wealth and connections to systematically document every crime the society committed. I have spent decades placing evidence in archives, law firms, and historical societies across the country, waiting for researchers like yourselves to piece together the truth. The letter detailed Thomas's remarkable 40-year investigation. After accepting the Preservation Society's deal in 1896, he had used his business success to build relationships with lawyers, historians, and officials. He had quietly purchased documents, bribed clerks for access to sealed records, and even hired private investigators to track down evidence of the Society's crimes. I located all 4 of my siblings, Thomas wrote, though I could never approach them directly. My sister Mary, known as Mary Henderson, lived a quiet life in Milwaukee and died peacefully in 1943, never knowing her true identity. She had 6 children who grew up believing their grandmother was an orphan. My brother William, called William Chin, became a teacher in San Francisco and passed away in 1939. He spent his life helping other children, though he never understood why he felt such a deep need to protect the innocent. Dr. Harper felt tears welling in her eyes as she read about each sibling's fate. Thomas had watched over them from a distance, ensuring they were safe and successful without ever revealing himself. My youngest brother Joseph, renamed Joseph Patterson, became a minister in Colorado. He died in 1947, having dedicated his life to fighting injustice, though he never knew why corruption and abuse of power affected him so deeply. My youngest sister, little Emma, whom you know from the photograph, was called Emma Morrison by her adoptive family. She became a nurse and spent her career caring for others. She died in 1951, having saved countless lives, driven by a compassion she could never fully explain. James wiped his eyes as he read the next section. I attended each of their funerals from a distance, the only member of our family present to say goodbye. They lived good lives, but they died without ever knowing who they truly were or that they had a brother who loved them enough to sacrifice his own happiness for their safety. The letter's final sections revealed the true scope of Thomas's lifelong mission. He had documented 17 families that the Preservation Society had eliminated between 1878 and 1890. He had identified 43 children who had been placed with conspirator families and forced to forget their identities. Most remarkably, he had preserved evidence that would allow their descendants to learn the truth about their heritage. I have established trust funds for the descendants of every victim family, Thomas wrote. These funds have been growing for decades and will be distributed once my story is made public. But more importantly, I have documented the locations where each family's personal belongings and records were hidden by the Preservation Society. Every family deserves to have their story told. Dr. Harper turned to the final page, her voice breaking as she read Thomas's closing words. I could not save my parents, and I could not reunite with my siblings in life, but I have ensured that our family's legacy will live on. The photograph you found was the key I always intended it to be, the beginning of a trail that would lead you to justice for not just my family, but for all the families the Preservation Society destroyed. I have lived my entire life in the shadows, but I have never stopped fighting for the truth. I hope that by the time you read this, the world is ready to hear these stories. I hope that my sacrifice, and the sacrifices of my siblings, will finally mean something. The letter was signed simply, Thomas Whitmore Morrison, the last surviving member of the Whitmore family. 6 months later, Dr. Harper published The Whitmore Conspiracy, A Century of Hidden Truth, which became a landmark work in American historical research. The book led to the identification of over 100 descendants of Preservation Society victims, many of whom had spent their lives wondering about their family origins. The 5 children in the 1881 photograph finally had their story told, and Thomas's 70-year plan had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The Whitmore family was restored to history, and the Preservation Society's crimes were finally exposed. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas Whitmore had achieved something that had seemed impossible. He had found a way to reunite his family across time itself. In death, the 5 Whitmore children were finally together again, their story preserved forever and their sacrifice honored by those who came after. The photograph now hangs in the Smithsonian Institution, with a plaque that reads, "The Whitmore Children 1881. Their silence was forced, but their truth endures." Dr. Harper often visited the exhibit, looking into the faces of the 5 children and marveling at the courage of the eldest boy who had spent his entire life ensuring that justice would eventually prevail. Thomas Whitmore had proven that even the most powerful conspiracies could not ultimately silence the truth, and that love, even love that required a lifetime of sacrifice, could transcend any obstacle.